It's the story of a submarine lost in World War II with a unique connection to Milwaukee, and also how new images from deep underwater are keeping the sub's legacy alive.
On January 30th, 1945, the ship Wilhelm Gustloff left the German port of Gotenhafen with more than 10,000 people on board. She was not a warship. She was a passenger ship that had been turned into an evacuation ship. Refugees were everywhere, on the decks, in the hallways, in every empty space. Women, children, wounded soldiers, civilians who had nowhere left to go. That night, at 9:16 p.m., 3 Soviet torpedoes hit the ship. The Wilhelm Gustloff sank in just 40 minutes. More than 9,000 people died in the freezing Baltic Sea. It is still the worst ship disaster in history. 6 times more people died than on the Titanic. For 79 years, the wreck lay in 150 feet of water off the coast of Poland. People knew where it was. The Baltic Sea is shallow. Divers had visited the wreck many times, but no one had gone deep inside. No one had explored the places where thousands had died. Then, in March 2024, a Polish research team sent down a special underwater drone. It was built to enter wrecks. What the cameras saw inside the Wilhelm Gustloff was not just a broken ship. It showed the last 40 minutes of pure fear. And what they found proved something terrible. Most people did not die from the explosions. They died trapped, crushed, frozen, drowned in total darkness, all while fighting each other to reach exits that were already underwater. The video shows signs of mass panic, of people desperate to live, of human behavior at its worst. And 79 years later, they are still there. More than 9,000 bodies. The largest mass grave at sea in history. Still inside the ship, still in the hallways where they died, still frozen in their final moments. The Wilhelm Gustloff was built in 1937 as a cruise ship for a Nazi group called Strength Through Joy. She was meant to give cheap vacations to German workers. It was propaganda, a way to show that the Nazi government cared about normal people. She was 684 feet long. She could carry 1,465 passengers in comfort. She was named after Wilhelm Gustloff, a Nazi leader who was killed in 1936. Hitler himself came to her launch. She was a symbol of Nazi power and success. For 2 years, she sailed on happy cruises. Workers who had never taken a vacation went to Norway, Italy, and Spain. The ship was meant to prove that Nazism worked. Then the war began. The cruise ship became a military ship. She was painted gray, first a hospital ship, then housing for sailors, then a transport ship. By 1945, she had one last job: evacuation. By January 1945, the Eastern Front had collapsed. Soviet armies were moving fast across Poland and East Prussia. German civilians had a terrible choice: run west or face the Red Army. Millions chose to run. The sea evacuation was called Operation Hannibal. It became the largest sea evacuation in history. The Wilhelm Gustloff was pulled into service. She was built for 1,065 people. On January 30th, 1945, more than 10,000 were on board. Some say as many as 10,600. No one knows the real number. No one was keeping good records. People just rushed aboard, desperate to escape. On board were 918 German naval officers and crew going to Kiel, over 370 young women from the Navy Auxiliary, about 4,000 refugees, mostly women and children from East Prussia, and about 5,000 more refugees, wounded soldiers, and sailors whose numbers were never written down. The ship was made for Monover 165. She carried 10,000. Every cabin was full. Hallways were packed with people sitting on the floor. The swimming pool was drained and filled with refugees. People slept on tables, on decks, anywhere there was space. The Gustloff left Gotenhafen at 12:30 p.m. on January 30th. She had only 1 torpedo boat and 2 small patrol boats as escort. Not enough protection, but that was all they had. They sailed west toward Kiel. It was freezing. Ice formed on the ship. The Baltic Sea was partly frozen, and under the water, a Soviet submarine was waiting. Submarine S-13. It was commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko. He was skilled, but he had problems. He had been punished before for drinking and leaving his post without permission. This mission was his chance to fix his career. His orders were simple: sink German evacuation ships. That afternoon, Marinesko saw the Wilhelm Gustloff through his periscope. A huge passenger ship, almost no protection, sailing through dangerous waters, a perfect target. He followed the ship for hours, waiting for the right moment. At 9:08 p.m., he gave the order: fire 4 torpedoes. At 9:16 p.m., 3 torpedoes hit the ship, one after another. The first hit the front, the second hit the swimming pool full of refugees, the third hit the engine room. The explosions were enormous. The first torpedo killed hundreds at once. People sleeping in the front were crushed or blown apart. The second hit was even worse. The swimming pool was below the waterline. More than 400 refugees were inside, and in one moment, the water rushed in. The explosion killed everyone in that space and breached the hull across a 40-foot section. The engine room torpedo killed all power. The lights went out. Emergency lighting came on for a few seconds, then failed. 10,000 people were plunged into total darkness. The ship immediately listed to port. The angle increased rapidly. 15 degrees, 20 degrees. Within minutes, the decks were no longer horizontal. They were slopes, and 10,000 people began trying to escape. The panic was immediate and absolute. In the darkness, people couldn't see where they were going. They pushed toward where they thought exits were. They climbed over each other. They trampled those who fell. Parents lost children in the chaos. Families were separated. Everyone was screaming. The corridors were packed so tightly that people couldn't move. Those in the middle of the crush were pinned in place. As the list increased, people began sliding downward into the port side. Bodies piled against the walls. Those on the bottom were suffocated or crushed by the weight of dozens of people on top of them. The staircases became death traps. People trying to climb up were fighting against the increasing angle and against hundreds of others trying to do the same. The stairs were slippery with ice and seawater. People fell. Those behind them trampled them trying to get up. Bodies blocked the stairways. On the boat deck, crew members tried to launch lifeboats, but the list was already too severe. Lifeboats on the port side were hanging against the ship's hull, impossible to launch. Lifeboats on the starboard side were hanging outward over empty air. When crews tried to lower them, many capsized or crashed down onto the decks, crushing people below. Only a few lifeboats launched successfully. They held perhaps 200 people total. For a ship with 10,000 aboard, the rest would have to jump into the Baltic Sea and pray for rescue. But jumping meant survival for perhaps 15 minutes. The water temperature was 4 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill from hypothermia in less than 30 minutes. Most people didn't have life jackets. Many couldn't swim. And in the darkness, rescue ships couldn't see them. At 9:56 p.m., 40 minutes after the torpedoes struck, the Wilhelm Gustloff rolled onto her port side and went down. The suction pulled hundreds of people under. Those on deck who hadn't jumped were swept into the freezing water. Those still trapped inside drowned as the ship filled completely. The surviving escort vessels rescued everyone they could find in the darkness. They pulled people from the water. They recovered those clinging to debris. By dawn, they had saved approximately 1,200 people. Over 9,000 died. Most drowned. Many froze to death. Some were crushed in the panic. Others were trapped inside and went down with the ship. The Soviet Union declared it a military victory. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been carrying German naval personnel, which made her a legitimate target under the rules of war. Captain Marinesco was declared a hero of the Soviet Union. Germany couldn't protest. They were losing the war. The sinking was buried in propaganda. The Nazi regime didn't want to admit that 9,000 Germans had died fleeing the Red Army. After the war ended, the story was forgotten. The Wilhelm Gustloff became a footnote, a tragedy that history moved past, but the ship was still there, and the bodies were still there, over 9,000 of them, the largest mass grave in maritime history, lying in 150 feet of water off the coast of Poland. For decades, divers visited the wreck. It sits in relatively shallow water, accessible to technical divers with proper equipment, but the Polish government restricted diving and eventually prohibited it entirely. The wreck is a war grave. It must be respected. The restrictions didn't stop everyone. Illegal dives occurred. Artifacts were looted. Some divers reported seeing bodies inside. Others claimed the wreck was empty, that the bodies had long since decomposed or been scattered by currents. The truth remained uncertain until 2024. In March 2024, a Polish research institute received special permission to conduct a comprehensive survey of the Wilhelm Gustloff. The goal was to document the wreck's current condition, assess the deterioration, and determine if human remains were still present. The team deployed a compact ROV specifically designed for penetrating shipwrecks. It was small enough to maneuver through narrow corridors and doorways. It carried 4K cameras, sonar imaging, and powerful lights. On March 15, 2024, the ROV descended to the wreck. The Wilhelm Gustloff lies on her port side in 150 feet of water. The starboard hull is exposed. The funnels have collapsed. The superstructure is deteriorating, but the hull itself is largely intact. The ROV entered through a damaged section of the boat deck and descended into the ship's interior. The first compartment was a passenger cabin. Bunks lined the walls, and on those bunks, clothing, suitcases, personal belongings. A child's toy on the floor. Everything exactly where it had been left when the torpedoes hit. The camera moved into the corridor, and that's when the operators realized the full horror of what they were seeing. The corridor was packed with debris, but not just debris, bodies. The cold Baltic water had preserved them, not perfectly, but enough. Skeletons clothed in rotting fabric, skulls visible through gaps in the debris, entire bodies piled against the portside walls where they had slid when the ship listed. If you're still watching this, hit subscribe. What the drone found in the lower decks is even worse. This is where thousands of people died in absolute terror. The ROV continued deeper into the ship. It entered the area where the drained swimming pool had been, the space where the second torpedo struck. The destruction here was total. The hull was breached, structural supports were torn away, and in the wreckage, evidence of the explosion's victims, the cameras, captured what survivors had described. People packed so tightly they couldn't move. When the torpedo exploded, it killed everyone in that space instantly. The blast wave, the shrapnel, the pressure, over 400 people dead in less than a second. But worse was what the drone found in the spaces adjacent to the swimming pool. Corridors that had flooded immediately after the explosion. These passages had been packed with refugees trying to move through the ship. When water rushed in, they had nowhere to go. The crush of bodies blocked the exits. They drowned standing up, pressed against each other, unable to fall even as they died. The ROV's cameras showed skeletal remains still in those positions, upright, held in place by the density of bodies around them, an entire corridor filled with the dead, preserved by the cold water, frozen in the moment of their deaths. The drone moved to the lower decks. This was where the poorest refugees had been housed, down in steerage-level accommodations, far below the waterline. When the ship listed, water had rushed down the stairwells and filled these spaces first. The camera showed evidence of desperate attempts to escape. A door blocked from the inside. Someone had tried to jam it shut, trying to keep the water out. It hadn't worked. Water had come through the gaps. The door remained jammed. Whoever was behind it had drowned anyway. In another compartment, scratch marks on a steel door. Someone had been locked in or trapped. They had clawed at the door with their bare hands. The marks were deep enough to still be visible through the rust. That person had died on the other side of that door, close enough to touch freedom, but unable to reach it. The most disturbing discovery came in what had been a crew berthing area. The ROV's lights illuminated a space filled with small skeletons, children, dozens of them. They had been gathered in this compartment, perhaps by adults trying to protect them. When the water came in, they had the east side, clustered in the highest corner trying to stay above the rising flood. The corner where their remains were found 79 years later, still together, still in the place where the water finally reached them. The operators watching the live feed couldn't continue. They stopped the survey temporarily. Some of them were crying. They had expected to find a shipwreck. They had found something closer to a horror film. But they continued. The documentation was important. The families deserved to know. History demanded the truth. The ROV surveyed the engine room where the third torpedo had struck. The machinery was destroyed. The explosion had torn through the engines and breached the hull. But some crew members had survived the blast. They had sealed themselves in auxiliary compartments, trying to stay ahead of the flooding. The cameras found evidence of their final acts. Tools scattered near damaged equipment. Someone had been trying to repair the pumps, wrenches still lying where they had been, dropped. A flashlight on the floor, corroded but recognizable. They had worked in darkness trying to save the ship. It hadn't mattered. The flooding was too extensive. The list was too severe. The Gustloff was doomed from the moment the first torpedo struck. The survey revealed the full scope of the disaster. Over 9,000 people had died. But they hadn't all died the same way. Some had been killed instantly by the explosions. Hundreds had drowned in the first few minutes as water flooded the lower decks. Thousands had died in the panic, crushed or trampled or pushed underwater by the desperate crowds. Others had frozen to death in the Baltic Sea after the ship went down. And some had been trapped in air pockets inside the ship. They had survived for minutes or even hours after the sinking, breathing stale air in sealed compartments, waiting for rescue that would never come. Eventually, the air pockets had filled with water or the air had turned toxic. They had suffocated or drowned. Alone in the dark, the evidence was everywhere. The scratch marks on doors, the bodies clustered in corners, the tools dropped mid-repair, the children gathered together. This wasn't a clean death. This was prolonged terror followed by drowning, freezing, or suffocation. The Wilhelm Gustloff is the deadliest shipwreck in history, but it's barely remembered. The Titanic killed 1,500 people and became legend. The Gustloff killed 9,000 and was forgotten. Why? Because the dead were German, because the ship was named after a Nazi. Because the sinking happened in the final months of a war Germany started. Because the victors write history and the Soviets who sank her had no interest in memorializing the victims. But the victims were real. They were civilians, refugees fleeing a war zone, women and children who had done nothing except be born in the wrong country at the wrong time. And they died horribly. The 2024 drone survey forced people to confront this. The footage was undeniable. The evidence was clear. Thousands of innocent people had died in terror and chaos. Their bodies were still there, and history had forgotten them. The Polish research team consulted with German authorities and international maritime law experts. The Wilhelm Gustloff is technically a war grave. The crew members who died are military casualties. But what about the civilians? What about the children? Under international law, shipwrecks containing human remains must be treated with respect. Artifacts cannot be removed without permission. Bodies must not be disturbed. The site should be preserved. But the Gustloff presents unique challenges. She lies in relatively shallow water in one of the busiest shipping lanes in Europe. Commercial vessels pass overhead constantly. Fishing nets have snagged on the wreck. Illegal divers have looted artifacts for decades. The Polish government has declared the area off-limits. The wreck is protected. But enforcement is difficult. The Baltic Sea doesn't belong to any single nation. Multiple countries have jurisdiction over different parts of it. Germany has requested that the wreck be designated a protected memorial site. Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, has opposed this. In Soviet and Russian history, the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff is a military victory. Marinesko is still celebrated as a hero. Acknowledging the civilian deaths would complicate that narrative. The politics remain unresolved. But the wreck doesn't care about politics. It sits on the seafloor with the evidence of what happened. The bodies, the personal belongings, the scratch marks, the children clustered in the corner. The 2024 survey documented everything. The research team created a 3D model of the wreck showing the locations of major debris fields and areas of human remains. They identified at least 14 separate spaces where bodies are concentrated: the forward berthing areas, the swimming pool space, the lower deck corridors, the engine room. Compartments. Each space tells its own story. The swimming pool shows evidence of the torpedo explosion. The bodies there died instantly. The lower corridors show evidence of drowning and crushing. The bodies there died in panic and chaos. The sealed compartments show evidence of people who survived longer. The bodies there died slowly. The survey team estimated that at least 5,000 bodies remain inside the wreck, maybe more. The rest were either in spaces now too dangerous to access, scattered by currents over the decades, or swept out to sea when the ship initially sank. 5,000 bodies. The largest concentration of human remains in any shipwreck ever surveyed, all preserved by the cold Baltic water, all still wearing the clothes they died in, all still in the positions they held when the water finally took them. The footage was partially released to the public with all images of human remains removed. The documentary showed the ship's structure, the damage patterns, and the personal artifacts. It described what was found but didn't show it directly. But the research team knows what they saw, and they've described it in reports that are difficult to read. Bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep in some corridors, small skeletons clustered together, evidence of people who had clawed at walls and doors until their fingers broke, evidence of mass death in confined spaces. This is what happens when 10,000 people try to evacuate a sinking ship in 40 minutes in the middle of winter in total darkness. Civilization disappears. Survival instinct takes over. People push, they climb over each other. The weak die first, the strong die next. Eventually, everyone dies. The survivors who made it off the Gustloff described scenes they could never forget. Mothers throwing children overboard hoping someone would catch them. People jumping from the upper decks and breaking bones on impact with the water. Crowds pushing through corridors so packed that people suffocated standing, up before the water even reached them. In the water, the cold killed within minutes. Most people were unconscious from hypothermia before they drowned. That was mercy compared to what happened inside the ship. The Wilhelm Gustloff took 40 minutes to sink. For people trapped in the lower decks, that was 40 minutes of knowing death was coming, of hearing water rushing closer, of feeling the ship list further, of being pressed against walls by crowds of panicking people, of screaming for help that wasn't coming, and when the water finally reached them, they drowned in darkness surrounded by the dead and dying. The cold Baltic water would have been a shock. Lungs would have seized, breathing would have become gasping, consciousness would have faded, but not instantly. Drowning takes time, maybe 60 seconds, maybe 90, long enough to know it's happening, long enough to fight it, long enough to fail. Over 9,000 people died that way. The biggest maritime disaster in human history happened in 40 minutes in the Baltic Sea, and the world forgot about it. The drone survey in 2024 brought the Wilhelm Gustloff back into public consciousness. News coverage spread worldwide. Documentaries were produced. Survivors who were children in 1945, now in their 80s, gave interviews. The few still alive shared their memories. But the coverage also sparked controversy. Some argued that the victims were German and therefore complicit in Nazi crimes. They deserved no sympathy. The sinking was justice for what Germany had done to Europe. Others argued that children are not responsible for their government's actions, that refugees fleeing a war zone are civilians, regardless of nationality, that 9,000 deaths in terror and chaos is a tragedy no matter who the victims were. The debate continues. But the wreck doesn't care about debates. It sits in 150 feet of water with the evidence of what happened. The bodies stacked in corridors, the children in the corner, the scratch marks on the doors. The Wilhelm Gustloff will eventually collapse. Corrosion is slowly weakening the hull. Someday, the structure will fail. The compartments will open to the current. The bodies will be scattered or consumed. The evidence will dissolve into the Baltic. But for now, it's preserved. A memorial to the cost of war, not the cost paid by soldiers, but the cost paid by civilians, by refugees, by children who didn't choose the war but died in it anyway. 150 feet down in the cold Baltic Sea, the Wilhelm Gustloff holds 5,000 bodies. They're still there in the corridors where they died, still pressed against the walls, still clustered together, still frozen in their final moments. The largest mass grave in maritime history. A testament to what happens when war meets humanity. The drone showed us what the history books left out: the terror, the chaos, the evidence of mass death in confined spaces, the reality behind the statistics. 9,000 dead isn't just a number, it's 9,000. Individual deaths. Each one a person, each one a story, each one a moment of terror that ended in darkness. The cameras captured it all. And now we have to live with that knowledge. The Wilhelm Gustloff isn't just a shipwreck. It's a warning about what we're capable of doing to each other, what war costs when measured in bodies stacked in corridors and children dying together in the dark. If this story impacted you, subscribe and share. The Wilhelm Gustloff's victims deserve to be remembered regardless of which flag they lived under.